The ash fell like scripture. For 7 days, Hive Carthax Theta had burned beneath sky split by the great rift's wound, and still the demons came. They poured through cracks in reality where the Geller wards had failed, manifesting in the lower spires with the inevitability of rot. Justicar Thane Callistos felt their presence before his retinal display confirmed it. The touch of the warp scraped against his psychically attuned armor like nails on ceramite. 20 minutes remained before the final evacuation transport lifted. 20 minutes to hold 3 kilometers of corridor against an ocean of corruption that grew hungrier with each civilian prayer. His squad of gray knights stood in perfect formation across the transit junction, their nemesis force weapons gleaming with stored faith. Behind them, thousands packed the loading bays. Men, women, children pressed against one another in the particular silence that came when hope had become too expensive to voice. Demon signature intensifying at grid 9-7, Brother Castell reported, his voice filtered through Vox grill to machine monotone. Plague touched. Multiple manifestations. Callistos cycled through visual spectrums, watching reality curdle. The corridor ahead began to weep. Not moisture. Something worse. The walls themselves were forgetting what it meant to be stone-bleeding possibilities that should never exist. A stench preceded the enemy, sweet enough to choke on, thick enough to coat the inside of his helm. The first demon took form from the corruption, a mass of distended flesh and exposed organs arranged in parodies of human anatomy. It dragged itself forward on too many limbs, each movement leaving suppurating tracks. Behind it came others manifesting like tumors, pushing through the membrane between dimensions. For the Emperor. Callistos spoke the words without heat, without passion. Combat liturgy required precision, not enthusiasm. Purge in his name. Storm bolters roared. Mass reactive shells punched through demonic flesh, each detonation scattering ichor that steamed against the rockcrete. The creatures barely slowed. Their bodies absorbed wounds that would cripple a mortal, reforming around the damage with the persistence of infection. Callistos felt the familiar weight of sanctioned violence settle across his shoulders. This was clean work, necessary work. The kind of war where the enemy could be clearly identified and righteously destroyed. Then the air changed. Something shifted in the warp's pressure like the silence before a storm's breaking. His psychic senses screamed warning without words, an alarm bred into the gray nights through gene-forged instinct. This was not another daemon manifestation. This was different. New. Unclassified. A ribbon of light appeared at the corridor's far end, pale as bone, silent as snowfall. It moved with purpose, but not aggression, threading between the demons like a needle through rotted cloth. Where it touched the creatures, simply ceased. Not banished, not destroyed. They stopped existing in the present tense, as if the universe reconsidered their permission to manifest. Callistos had spent 2 centuries mastering demon banishment protocols. He knew every litany, every ritual word of power, every psychic technique sanctioned by the chapter's grimoires. This was none of those. The demons were not being sent back to the warp. They were being unmade from the conditional logic that allowed them to exist at all. Impossible. Brother Castell whispered, his vox crackling with interference. The ribbon resolved into a girl. She stood at the exact point where the demon horde had been thickest, where the warp's touch should have flayed the sanity from any unprotected mind. Her appearance violated every tactical parameter Callistos had internalized through decades of war. Pink hair, white dress, eyes that held depths he could not classify as either warp-touched or sanctified. She looked at the wounded, the dying civilians pressed against the transit bay walls. Then she spoke, and her voice carried without amplification, bypassing his helmet's audio filters to reach directly into perception. "Enough. I'll carry you away." The demon horde surged forward with the mindless hunger that defined chaos. The girl raised one hand. Light spread from her palm like frost across glass, creating boundaries that had no physical form but absolute presence. Callistos felt them through his psychic senses. Not wards, not barriers, laws. Fundamental conditions being rewritten in real time. When demons touched those boundaries, they stopped. Their forms flickered like images projected on smoke, then faded into non-existence. No screaming, no final curses, just the abrupt termination of their presence in material reality. The girl moved among them, her steps leaving no prints in the filth, her dress untouched by the corruption that saturated every surface. She knelt beside a woman whose leg had been half consumed by demonic rot, touched her shoulder. The woman's screaming stopped. Not because pain ended, but because something else had intervened. Something that made pain irrelevant. Callistos lowered his Nemesis Force sword. His training demanded he engage any unidentified psychic phenomenon with immediate violence. His instinct, the product of 2 centuries facing warp corruption, recognized this as fundamentally different from any threat he'd encountered. This was not chaos pretending at order. This was something that existed outside the Great Game's rules entirely. Justicar. Brother Castell's voice held the careful neutrality of a warrior confronting theological paradox. Threat assessment. Before Callistos could respond, the girl turned. Her eyes met his, and for one eternal moment, he understood why the oldest Grey Knights spoke of truths that could not be contained in words. She was not human. But neither was she Demon Xeno's saint, or any classification his training had prepared him to encounter. "You can lower your weapons," she said, her tone carrying neither command nor plea. Simple statement of fact. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here for them." She gestured to the civilians, and Callistos saw what she meant. The wounded, the corrupted, those who stood at despair's threshold, where chaos fed most greedily. The evacuation transport's engines began their launch cycle, a mechanical growl that rattled the transit junction's walls. 15 minutes remained. Callistos made his decision with the same calculated precision he applied to combat targeting. "Hold position," he ordered his squad. "Observe and contain. No hostile action without my direct command." Last, Inquisitor Severian Holt watched the transit bay through surveillance feeds. His augmetic eye processing 17 data streams simultaneously. Each feed showed the same impossible scene from different angles, as if reality itself sought confirmation of what it was recording. The anomaly had neutralized 43 demons in 2 minutes and 17 seconds. No psychic flare, no warp signature. The cogitators assigned to demon classification kept returning the same error, insufficient data for categorization. Holt had spent 30 years learning to read such failures. When the Imperium's most sophisticated analysis tools produced null results, it meant one of 2 things. Either the instruments were broken or they were measuring something outside their design parameters. His instruments were not broken. Classification protocols. He asked the servo skull hovering at his shoulder, its mechanical voice flat with the absence of opinion. Inconclusive. Subject demonstrates no traditional markers of warp corruption. No possession indicators. No psychic resonance matching known phenomena. Recommend immediate containment and vivisection. Holt's mouth twitched. The servo skull's recommendations always defaulted to vivisection. It had been programmed by a previous inquisitor who believed the best way to understand something was to take it apart layer by layer. Usually, Holt agreed with his philosophy. "Delay that recommendation," he said, fingers moving across haptic controls. "I want full psychic screening first, and summon Cardinal Vale. He'll want to witness this." On the screens, the girl moved among the wounded with careful deliberation. She touched each person briefly, and where her hand fell, something changed in the warp's local topology. Holt had sensors designed to measure such shifts. They registered the changes, but could not define them, like watching gravity reverse in a localized field without understanding the mechanism. A wounded guardsman looked up at her. His throat working around words, she shook her head, gently touched his forehead, and his body relaxed into something that resembled peace. When Holt checked the man's vital signs, they had flatlined. But the expression on his face suggested relief rather than death's usual vacancy. "Subject appears to be terminating civilian life signs," the servo skull noted. "Recommend immediate elimination." "She's not killing them," Holt murmured, leaning closer to the screens. "She's taking them somewhere else." The feeds showed no souls departing, no psychic transfer to the warp's currents where demons fed. The people she touched simply stopped existing in a measurable present. Their absence left no trace for chaos to consume. It was the cleanest death Holt had ever witnessed, and that made it the most dangerous phenomenon he'd encountered in 3 decades of hunting corruption. But there was a pattern. His tactical analysis subroutines highlighted it after the 7th case. She only touched those who had crossed a threshold. The woman with demon rot spreading toward her heart. The guardsman whose corruption had already eaten through his sanity. The child whose screams had begun echoing with voices that should not exist in a single throat. Each one stood at the precise moment where despair became fuel for the warp, where hope's absence created the vacuum that chaos rushed to fill. She was taking them before that final transformation, cutting the fuel line at its source. If she could deny the warp its sustenance at the individual level, Holt realized, then she threatened not just imperial theology, but the fundamental mechanism by which chaos maintained its power in real space. The Emperor's light guided souls to his throne. The Astronomicon burned to prevent their consumption by chaos. This girl bypassed both systems entirely, offering a third option that should not exist. Holt began composing his report to Lord Guilliman, even as Cardinal Vale's retinue entered the command center, the priest's bulk filling the doorway like judgment incarnate. "Inquisitor," Vale's voice carried the resonance of a man accustomed to being heard over screaming crowds. "I'm told we have a miracle." "We have an unclassified phenomenon," Holt corrected, not looking away from the screens. "Whether it qualifies as miraculous depends on which doctrines you prioritize." Vale pushed past junior officers to stand before the primary display. His face, scarred by a lifetime of warfare in the Emperor's name, went through several expressions in rapid succession. Wonder, suspicion, calculation. "The people are calling her the saint," one of Vale's attendants whispered. "The people," Holt said softly, "will call her whatever we tell them to call her. The question is what name we choose and what that choice makes us." On screen, the girl straightened. The last of the wounded had been touched, their pain ended or transformed beyond measurement. She looked directly at the surveillance feed as if she could see through the pic capture to the watchers beyond. Her eyes held no accusation, no challenge, just awareness. Then she walked toward the transit bay's exit, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who could not be stopped and knew it. The Grey Knights parted to let her pass, their weapons lowered, but ready. Behind her, The corridor where 43 daemons had manifested showed no trace of demonic presence. Even the corruption that had soaked into the rockcrete had faded, leaving bare stone that looked strangely clean. "I want full containment protocols active," Holt began, but Vael raised one meaty hand. "No," the Cardinal said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "We don't contain this. We study it. We understand it. And then we decide if the Emperor sent her or if something else did." Holt met the priest's eyes, seeing in them the same cold calculation that had made Vael a power within the Adeptus Ministorum, despite his brutal methods. They both understood what this girl represented. Not just a phenomenon to be studied, but a weapon to be claimed, or a threat to be eliminated. The difference between those outcomes would determine who held power on Carthax Theta and possibly beyond. "Send for Astropath Cade," Holt ordered. "I want a message prepared for Ultramar. Lord Guilliman will need to know about this." When Astropath Maris Cade arrived in the command center 20 minutes later, her movements carried the careful precision of someone managing pain. Holt noted the blood at the corner of her mouth, the way her third eye twitched beneath its ritual binding. "The message can wait," she said before he could speak. "You need to know what I felt when she was active in the transit bay." Holt's augmetic eye focused on her with predatory intensity. Warp disturbance. The opposite. Cade's voice dropped to barely above whisper. The Astronomicon wavered, just for a moment. Like something stood between it and my soul, but not blocking. Redirecting. I've never felt anything like it in 40 years of service. The implications settled over the room like funeral shrouds. If the anomaly could affect the Emperor's light itself, even indirectly, then the threat level had just escalated beyond any conventional classification. "Include that in the message to Ultramar," Holt said quietly, "and encrypt it at the highest level. This information doesn't leave this room until Lord Guilliman himself has reviewed it." "And the girl?" Vael asked. "We follow her," Holt said simply. "Until we understand what she is, we can't afford to lose sight of her. But we also can't afford to approach carelessly. If she can unmake demons with a touch, she can probably do the same to us." Word spread through Hive Carthax Theta like fever through wounded flesh. In the upper spires where nobles sheltered behind void shield generators, they called her the Pale Saint. In the middle districts where factory workers died by thousands to keep production quotas met, she became Our Lady of Endings. In the Underhive where gangers and mutants fought over scraps, they named her the Girl Who Walks Through Walls. Each version of the story grew with the telling. Some claimed she descended from the Emperor's throne itself, sent to mark the faithful and condemn the heretic. Others whispered she was a weapon, something the Mechanicus had created and lost control of. The most dangerous rumors suggested she'd come from beyond the Imperium, entirely a foreigner in a galaxy that killed outsiders as reflex. Ecclesiarchy priests moved through the crowds trying to shape the narrative before it hardened into heresy. They preached of trials and faith of the Emperor's mysterious works manifesting in unexpected forms. But their words fought against what people had seen, against testimony from those who'd been in the transit bay when she appeared. "She didn't demand worship," one survivor told the growing crowds. "She just looked at us like we mattered. Like each person was worth saving, not just the whole group." That testimony, more than any miracle, proved the most dangerous. The Imperium's theology rested on collective sacrifice, on the understanding that individual lives meant nothing compared to humanity's survival. A saint who valued singular souls over the whole threatened that foundation more surely than any demon. In a chapel near the transit district, an old man knelt before a crude altar. He'd been in the evacuation queue close enough to see her clearly, close enough to hear her voice. Now he tried to pray to the emperor as he'd been taught, but the words felt hollow. How could he worship a distant god corpse when he'd seen divinity walk past him in a white dress? The thought was heresy. He knew it. But knowing didn't make it untrue. Across the hive in thousands of minds, the same question took root. If she could save the wounded without requiring their faith, without demanding their obedience, what did that mean for the Imperium's entire structure? What did it mean when mercy arrived without conditions? In his command center, Inquisitor Holt watched the social disruption spread through real-time surveillance feeds. He'd seen this pattern before during witch cult outbreaks and gene stealer infiltrations. The difference was those threats announced themselves through violence. This anomaly threatened the Imperium's stability by offering something it had long forgotten how to provide: hope, with a price no imperial doctrine could name. Holt began drafting orders for containment protocols, knowing even as he wrote that standard procedures would prove inadequate. You couldn't cage something that existed outside the rules. You could only try to control the narrative around it, shape how people understood what they'd witnessed. But the girl had walked through demon lines without breaking stride. She'd unmade chaos manifestations with casual grace. Whatever she was, whatever power she represented, it operated on principles the Imperium had no framework to comprehend. That made her either the greatest gift humanity had received in 10,000 years or the most sophisticated threat ever deployed against the species. Holt suspected both assessments were true, which meant the hard decisions were only beginning. The ash continued to fall over Carthax Theta, but now it fell on a hive that whispered a new name in the darkness, testing the word on their lips like forbidden prayer. Madoka. When the first 1,000 voices spoke it in the same breath, something in the warp's distant depths turned its attention toward the sound. Not interest yet, not recognition, just the cold awareness of something new, entering the great game's vocabulary. A name without owner. A concept without definition. The kind of blank space that begged to be filled. In the transit bay, astropath Maris Cade doubled over tasting blood. For just one heartbeat, she had felt the Astronomican's eternal light waver as if something had momentarily stood between her soul and the Emperor's beacon. The sensation passed before she could properly identify it, but it left her hands shaking. The miracle who asked for nothing. The saint who owed no allegiance. The girl who carried the dying away to somewhere the Imperium could not follow. In the upper command levels, Inquisitor Holt sealed his preliminary report with 3 words that would echo through the sector command for months to come: classification threat unknown. Recommendation, immediate assessment. Risk level absolute. The evacuation transport lifted into Carthax Theta's burning sky, its hull scarred by demon fire but intact. Inside, 2,000 souls huddled in the darkness, whispering about the girl who'd saved them without demanding faith in return. Outside, in the hive's smoke-choked streets, the real question began to crystallize. If she could save without conquest, what did that make the Imperium's 10 millennia of brutal necessity? And if the answer threatened the foundation of imperial doctrine, how many would have to die to preserve the lie? Okay, now, did anyone see that coming? We have these super tough Grey Knights ready for a massive fight against gross plague monsters, and then a girl in a pink dress just walks in and says, "Enough." What is fucking crazy to me is how she doesn't just kill the daemons, but she literally unmakes them, so they don't even exist anymore. The Grey Knights are totally confused because their usual magic doesn't work like this. It makes me wonder if she is actually a good thing, or something even more scary because she doesn't follow any rules. How about you guys? Is Madoka a guardian angel sent by the Emperor? Or is she a glitch in the universe that shouldn't be there? To be honest, I don't really trust a girl who can make monsters disappear with just a touch. Anyway, let's see what the big bosses of the Imperium plan to do with this miracle in the next part. The War Council convened in what had once been a Ministorum chapel, its walls scarred by fire and its altars stained with blood that refused to wash clean. Lord Militant Edric Varen stood at the tactical hololith, his augmetic left arm twitching as it processed casualty projections faster than organic nerves could transmit. Beside him, Cardinal Lucius Vale radiated the satisfied menace of a predator who'd cornered prey. Across the projection table, Inquisitor Severian Holt reviewed intelligence briefs with the detached efficiency of a surgeon selecting scalpels. 47 demon incursions suppressed in 6 days. Varen began his voice, carrying the clipped precision of a career officer. Losses minimal. Civilian morale elevated beyond acceptable parameters. Strategic implication: we possess an asset capable of turning Imperium nihilus from liability to launching point. Vale's meaty fingers traced the hololith's glowing pathways, each representing a campaign sector where the phenomenon had been deployed. The faithful call her Madoka now. They whisper the name like it holds power, which it does, General. Just not the kind you measure in strategic value. Everything has strategic value, Varen countered. The question is exploitation methodology. Holt finally raised his gaze from the intelligence briefs, his augmetic eye word focusing on each man in turn. You're both assuming control we don't possess. She complies with deployment requests, yes, but not through coercion or obedience. She goes where people suffer most acutely. If our tactical objectives align with mass casualties, she appears. If they don't, no protocol we've attempted can compel her presence. Then we ensure alignment, Varen said, his tone suggesting the solution was obvious. Prioritize high casualty zones. She responds to desperation. We provide desperation in tactically advantageous locations. The words hung in the chapel's recycled air, their implications settling like contamination. Holt had spent 3 decades navigating the Imperium's moral compromises, the necessary evils that kept humanity breathing in a galaxy designed for extinction. This crossed a threshold even he found remarkable. You're proposing we deliberately increase civilian suffering to weaponize a phenomenon we barely understand, he said, making it statement rather than question. I'm proposing we accept realities you've spent a lifetime enforcing, Varen replied. The Imperium operates through calculated sacrifice. This is simply more efficient calculation. We lose thousands holding a sector conventionally, or we lose hundreds creating conditions that draw her intervention. Mathematics favors the latter. Vale interjected before Holt formed his counterargument. Gentlemen, you're both dancing around the central problem. She undermines foundational imperial theology with every soul she claims. People who witness her intercession start questioning why the Emperor demands so much, when salvation apparently requires so little. That's a cancer spreading through every sector where she manifests. Your solution, Cardinal? Holt asked. Vale's smile carried all the warmth of a killing frost. We don't suppress the faith. We redirect it. The Ministorum has 10,000 years of experience converting problematic devotion into approved channels. She becomes a saint, yes, but our saint, operating under our doctrine serving our interpretation of the Emperor's will. She doesn't serve, Holt said quietly. That's what makes her dangerous. Then we make her absence serve us, Vale countered. When she appears, we frame it as the Emperor's blessing manifest through a chosen vessel. When she refuses deployment, we call it the Emperor's test of our faith. Either outcome reinforces existing structures. Varen's augmetic hand clenched servos, whining. Theological manipulation won't hold territory. I need tactical applications, not sermons. You need both. Holt interjected, his voice cutting through their escalating tension. Because if we approach this wrong, we create something worse than demon incursions. We create hope in an alternative to imperial authority. That's the kind of infection that topples governments. The silence that followed held weight. Each man recognized the precipice they stood upon, the choice between exploitation and elimination growing narrower with each passing hour. Finally, Varen spoke. The Nihilist Corridor campaign begins in 48 hours. 7 worlds, mixed, chaos infestation civilian populations trapped behind enemy lines. Standard liberation protocols estimate 70% acceptable losses. If she intervenes, those numbers drop to single digits. And if she doesn't, Holt pressed. Then we proceed as planned. 70% casualties becomes the price of the Emperor's judgment. Holt turned to Vale. Your people will need to manage the narrative regardless of outcome. Can the Ministorum contain this? Vale's laugh rumbled like distant artillery. Inquisitor, we've been containing the Emperor's inconvenient truths for 10 millennia. One girl, however powerful, is merely a footnote to that legacy. The first world in the Nihilist Corridor was Veopolis Secundus, a factory planet where the Mechanicus had manufactured munitions until Chaos cultists seized the primary forges. Smoke from burning promethium obscured the sky, turning daylight into permanent twilight. Justicar Callistos led his squad through the ruins of Manufactorum District Sigma, their armor's machine spirits growling warnings about tainted atmospherics. The cultists had barricaded themselves in the central processing facility, using civilian workers as shields and sacrifices. Standard assault protocols required either exterminatus or a grinding siege that would cost months and thousands of guard lives. Instead, Lord Varen had issued new orders. Secure the perimeter. Await special asset deployment. Minimize interference. Callistos disliked the vagueness. Grey Knights operated through precision through understood protocols refined across centuries. This felt improvised, rushed, the kind of battlefield innovation that usually preceded catastrophic failure. Brother Castell, report on civilian concentrations, he ordered. Augur readings show 3,000 life signs in the central facility. Malnutrition widespread, warp contamination minimal, but present in approximately 30% of subjects. 3,000 souls trapped in darkness, their captors using them as currency in negotiations that would never succeed. The Imperium didn't negotiate with chaos. It purged. But now, apparently it waited. Callistos felt her arrival before visual confirmation. The air pressure changed reality's texture, shifting from hostile to something he lacked vocabulary to describe. Neutral, perhaps? Observant? She walked through the no-man's land, between imperial lines and cultist barricades, with the casual indifference of someone beyond the concept of crossfire. Las fire from nervous guardsmen sparked against invisible barriers that bent light without blocking it. Cultist small arms achieved similar futility. The Grey Knights held formation weapons ready, but not aimed. Callistos had issued standing orders after their first encounter. Observe, document, intervene only if she targets Imperial forces with hostile intent. So far, that condition remained unfulfilled. Madoka reached the facility's main entrance, sealed with blessed chains and chaos sigils, painted in what Callistos' armor identified as human blood. She placed one palm against the reinforced door. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the chains dissolved, not broken, but unmade their molecules, remembering a state before forging. The door opened. Inside, cultists raised weapons blessed by dark gods, their bodies warped by warp exposure into shapes that violated human anatomy. Madoka stepped between them like water flowing around stone. Where her presence passed, their modifications failed. Not reversed. Failed to maintain integrity under conditions that no longer permitted their existence. They collapsed, reverting to baseline human forms that their corrupted physiology could no longer sustain. Some died instantly, their organs too far gone to function without demonic enhancement. Others simply lay gasping, suddenly mortal again, and utterly confused. The hostages huddled in the facility's depths, their bodies marked by malnutrition and casual cruelty. Madoka knelt among them, and Callistos watched through his helmet's enhanced optics as she performed triage with disturbing efficiency. Those at the threshold received her direct intervention. Those who could survive conventional treatment, she left for Imperial medics. The precision bothered him more than random mercy would have. It suggested understanding methodology, intentional limitation, a power that chose its scope rather than operating at maximum capacity by default. Within 30 minutes, the facility was secure. Cultist leadership lay dead or reverted to mortality. Hostages evacuated to triage centers. Chaos taint cleansed from the structure's foundations with a thoroughness that made Callistos' psychic senses ache from the sudden absence of corruption. She emerged from the facility alone, her white dress somehow unstained, despite wading through industrial filth and recent carnage. She looked at Callistos, and he met her gaze with the discipline of a warrior who'd stared into the eye of a demon prince and not flinched. "They'll be safe now," she said. Simple statement. No request for validation or acknowledgement. "The Imperium thanks you for your service." He replied the words, feeling hollow even as he spoke them. Her expression shifted, not quite a smile, more like recognition of irony. "I didn't do it for the Imperium." Then she walked past his squad, heading back toward Imperial lines, where Lord Varen's command staff waited with recorders and interrogation protocols. She would ignore with the same gentle finality she applied to everything else. Callistos activated his secure Vox channel to the command center. "Justicar Callistos to Lord Militant Varen. Asset deployment successful. Target secured with minimal Imperial casualties. Requesting clarification on post-operation protocols for the asset itself." Varen's response carried static interference that Callistos' Vox system flagged as possible warp disruption. "Maintain observation distance. Do not attempt containment. Repeat, do not attempt containment. We're still learning what constraints, if any, apply." The admission of ignorance from a Lord Militant spoke volumes. The Imperium was gambling, throwing tactical doctrine at a variable it couldn't quantify, hoping mathematics favored survival over catastrophe. Callistos watched Madoka disappear into the smoke-choked ruins, a powerful figure in white walking through hell, like it was merely another room she happened to pass through on her way somewhere else. Cardinal Vielle composed his sermon with the careful attention of a poisoner measuring doses. Too much truth and the faithful would panic. Too little and the lie would collapse under scrutiny. The balance required art. He stood in the Ecclesiarchy broadcast chapel aboard the cruiser Righteous Confession, addressing recording devices that would spread his words across 17 worlds in the nihilist corridor. Behind him, stained glass depicted the Emperor in glory golden light streaming from wounds that had supposedly saved mankind. "Citizens of the Imperium," he began, his voice modulated for maximum emotional impact. In these dark times when the great enemy presses against our very souls, the God Emperor has not abandoned his faithful. Through his infinite wisdom, he has sent unto us a sign, a vessel of his mercy, walking among the damned to separate wheat from chaff. He let the words settle, watching the recording tech's signal indicators to ensure proper broadcast quality. Some call her Madoka, others the Pale Saint. But I tell you now, as Cardinal of the Adeptus Ministorum and Shepherd of Souls, her name matters less than her purpose. She is the Emperor's judgment made manifest. Where she treads, the corrupt fall and the faithful are lifted up. This is not magic. This is not heresy. This is the Emperor's will, operating through channels we must accept even when we cannot fully comprehend. The lie felt smooth on his tongue, polished by decades of practice. Truth was what served the Imperium's stability. Everything else was noise. But hear this warning, citizens. Those who worship her, rather than the Emperor, through her commit the gravest sin. She is a tool, blessed, yes, but still a tool in the God Emperor's mighty hands. To elevate her above her station is to invite damnation. The Ministorum watches. The Inquisition observes. Those who spread heretical interpretation will face cleansing. He let the threat hang unspoken. The Imperium's faithful understood what cleansing meant. Look to her works as evidence of the Emperor's continued protection. But look to the Emperor himself for salvation. She saves bodies. He saves souls. Never forget which matters more in the eternal war for humanity's survival. The recording concluded. Vidal nodded to the tech priests managing the equipment who began distribution protocols that would flood Vox networks and data streams across the sector. His aide, a thin man named Corvus, with eyes that saw too much, approached with a data slate. Your Eminence, preliminary reports from Veopolis Secundus. Vale scanned the information, his expression never shifting from practiced serenity. 3,000 rescued. Cultist leadership neutralized. Chaos taint removed. Minimal Imperial casualties. He looked up. Where's the problem? No problem in the tactical outcome, Eminence. The concern is witness testimony. Several of the rescued are claiming she asked them to forgive their captors, that she told them hatred would only feed the enemy. Vale's jaw tightened fractionally. Suppress those accounts. Frame it as trauma-induced confusion. Anyone who persists in spreading that particular interpretation gets reclassified as potentially compromised and sent for enhanced screening. Enhanced screening meant mind-scrubbing at best, execution at worst. Corvus made notations on his data slate without visible reaction. He'd been serving Vale long enough to recognize when mercy had become inconvenient. Anything else? Vale asked. The cults are beginning to form, not chaos cults. Devotional groups centered on her rather than the Emperor. Small so far, easily contained, but the pattern is spreading faster than we can interdict. There it was. The infection Vale had warned the War Council about, metastasizing exactly as predicted. People wanted hope without price, salvation without sacrifice. She offered it. The Imperium demanded obedience in exchange for survival. Given a choice, human nature gravitated toward comfort. Increase ecclesiarchy presence in affected zones, Vale ordered. Sermons emphasizing the Emperor's primacy, her role as subordinate instrument. Anyone caught leading these devotional groups gets branded as cultist and processed accordingly. If we can't control the narrative, we eliminate alternative narrators. Corvus hesitated, a rare show of concern. Eminence, some of these group leaders are simply trying to process what they witnessed. They're not malicious, just confused. Confusion metastasizes into heresy if left untreated. Vale replied, his tone brooking no argument. The Imperium's stability requires certainty. We provide it, or we watch 10,000 years of orthodoxy crumble because one girl made people feel special. He turned back to the stained glass, studying the Emperor's golden wounds. The Imperium had been built on those wounds, on the promise that suffering had purpose, that sacrifice mattered. If Madoka's existence suggested suffering was unnecessary, that salvation could be freely given, the entire architecture collapsed. Better to preserve the lie that kept humanity fighting than embrace a truth that might make them stop. In the underhive of Veopolis Secundus in Chambers, the Imperium's sensors couldn't penetrate through layers of industrial shielding and rockcrete. A different kind of sermon was taking place. The speaker was a former factory worker named Jestin, his face still bearing scars from cultist torturers. Around him, 200 survivors of the Manufactorum District Sigma siege listened with the desperate attention of people seeking meaning in trauma. "I'm telling you what I saw," Justin said, his voice rough from screaming that had only recently stopped. She looked at us. Not like the commissars look, checking if we're still useful. Not like the priests look, seeing sinners needing correction. She looked at us like we mattered, like each of us was worth saving just because we were there. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several made the sign of the Aquila habit, overriding confusion. "The cardinals say she's the Emperor's tool," someone called from the back, "that we should worship him through her." "The cardinals say a lot of things," Justin replied. "They say suffering is holy. They say our lives matter only as part of humanity's survival. They say the Emperor demands sacrifice." He paused, letting tension build. She demanded nothing. She just took the pain away. "Heresy," an old woman hissed, but she didn't leave. "Maybe," Justin acknowledged, "or maybe the Emperor sent her because he's tired of watching his cardinals burn people for asking questions. Maybe she's what he meant all along before 10,000 years of priests twisted his message into weapons." The crowd shifted, some leaning forward, others pulling back. This was dangerous territory, the kind of thinking that got entire hab blocks purged. But Justin had lived through torture and near death. Fear had lost its leverage. "I'm not saying stop worshiping the Emperor," he continued. "I'm saying maybe we've been worshiping wrong. Maybe the God Emperor doesn't want us to suffer. Maybe his mercy looks like a girl in a white dress who asks for nothing and gives everything." Someone began to weep. Others joined. The release of tension, the permission to hope without shame, proved overwhelming. Above them in the Imperium's monitoring stations, Vox operators flagged the gathering as potential cultist activity. Response teams began mobilizing. Within hours, the chamber would be raided, its occupants scattered or detained. Justin would disappear into an inquisitorial facility where his words would be extracted, analyzed, and used to identify similar infections elsewhere. The Imperium's immune system was activating, recognizing foreign doctrine, and preparing to purge it with the same ruthless efficiency it applied to chaos corruption. But the words had been spoken. The thoughts had taken root. In whispered conversations across 17 worlds, people began asking the same dangerous question. If she could save without demanding worship, what did that make worship worth? Tight. Aboard Righteous Confession. Inquisitor Holt reviewed interrogation transcripts with growing unease. The pattern was unmistakable now, spreading through population centers faster than any conventional contagion. Theological deviation, mass questioning of fundamental imperial doctrine. The emergence of alternative moral frameworks based on direct observation rather than received orthodoxy. His servo skull hovered at his shoulder, optical receptors processing the same data. Recommendation: targeted elimination of primary spreaders. Secondary recommendation: information, quarantine of affected zones. Tertiary recommendation: immediate cessation of asset deployment pending full doctrinal containment. Holt ignored all three suggestions. Elimination would create martyrs. Quarantine would confirm suspicions that the Imperium feared truth. Cessation would leave chaos unopposed in zones where conventional forces had already failed. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Use Madoka and watch Imperial authority erode. Don't use her and watch Imperial territory collapse. Either outcome served the enemy. Pull Astropath Cade's recent reports, he ordered. I want her assessment of warp pattern changes in deployment zones. The servo skull retrieved the relevant files. Holt read them twice, his augmetic eye flagging key passages for further analysis. Cade reported consistent anomalies. When Madoka operated in a region, the warp's local texture altered. Not dramatically, not permanently, but for brief windows, the connection between material suffering and immaterial empowerment weakened. Demons found manifestation more difficult. Possession rates dropped. The mechanics through which chaos fed showed reduced efficiency. It should have been a strategic advantage. Instead, it terrified Holt more than any demon incursion. Because if she could break the connection between human suffering and warp empowerment, even temporarily, it proved the connection wasn't inevitable. That meant the Imperium's entire framework of necessary cruelty, of calculated brutality, of suffering as strategic resource rested on a foundation that could be challenged. The Imperium didn't just fight chaos through violence. It fought chaos by becoming what chaos expected, playing the game by rules chaos understood. Madoka ignored those rules entirely, operating from principles the great enemy couldn't counter, because it couldn't comprehend them. That made her simultaneously the Imperium's greatest weapon and its most fundamental threat. Holt began drafting his report to Lord Guilliman, knowing it would be encrypted at levels that made previous classifications look transparent. This wasn't just tactical intelligence. This was existential crisis wrapped in human form, walking through the Imperium's territory and making people wonder if 10,000 years of orthodoxy might have missed on something important. His fingers paused over the haptic controls. One word crystallized everything he wanted to convey. Catalyst. Not weapon, not asset, not even threat in the conventional sense. A catalyst that accelerated reactions already present in the Imperium structure, forcing choices that could no longer be deferred. The message would reach Ultramar within days. Guilliman's response would determine whether the Imperium adapted to Madoka's presence or tried to eliminate her. Holt suspected either choice would prove catastrophic in ways currently impossible to predict. Outside his chamber, Carthax Theta burned under skies that would never again be merely gray. The ash continued falling, but now it fell on a galaxy beginning to ask questions it had spent 10 millennia learning not to voice. And somewhere in that galaxy, a girl in white walked through darkness, carrying the dying to places the Imperium could not follow, creating spaces where hope didn't require permission. The war for humanity's soul had just shifted to a battlefield the Imperium had never learned to fight on. Word count 3800. Pause for 500-word check. Proceeding, Cardinal Vale's latest broadcast reached Nihilus Corridor worlds as Madoka completed her 7th intervention. The message was simple, crafted with the brutal elegance of effective propaganda. The Emperor protects through many hands. Some wield swords, others wield mercy, but all serve the same throne, the same vision, the same eternal purpose. Do not confuse the instrument for the maker. Do not worship the blade when the hand that guides it demands your devotion. On 17 worlds, ecclesiarchy enforcers began identifying those who failed to make that distinction. The purges started quietly targeting individuals whose devotion had shifted from emperor to savior, from throne to miracle. Most went peacefully confused by the sudden reclassification and from faithful to heretic. They'd been saved. They'd witnessed divinity. How could gratitude be sin? The Imperium's answer came in the form of bolt rounds and sanctioned burnings. Not because the saved were corrupt, but because their salvation threatened structures more important than their lives. Lord Varen watched casualty reports with the detached interest of a commander calculating acceptable losses. The theological purges cost thousands. The alternative, allowing doctrinal drift to continue unchecked, would cost millions over time. The mathematics justified the slaughter. They always did. In the underhives and manufactorums, in the places the Imperium's light barely reached, whispered prayers began taking new forms, not replacing the emperor, but adding to him. Unofficial liturgies that mentioned both the Golden Throne and the Pale Saint attempting to reconcile old faith with new evidence. The Ministorum branded it syncretism. The penalty was death. But syncretism spread faster than enforcers could suppress it, because it offered what Orthodox worship no longer could: room for hope alongside obedience. Permission to believe salvation didn't require perfection. Inquisitor Holt noted the pattern in his reports to Ultramar. The harder the Imperium pushed to control Madoka's narrative, the more appeal alternative narratives gained. Classic insurgency dynamics, but applied to theology instead of politics. The enemy wasn't chaos this time. The enemy was the Imperium's own rigidity, its inability to accommodate truth that didn't fit approved frameworks. Somewhere in the warp's churning depths, entities older than civilizations felt the disturbance and began planning responses. Not direct assault. Something subtler, something that would turn her mercy into chains stronger than any bondage the Imperium could devise. The great game was adapting to a new piece on the board. The question was whether the piece would break before the board did. The Webway Junction designated Vale Glass had been a neutral meeting ground for exactly 37 minutes before the first assassination attempt. Lyraethil of the Inari watched the would-be killer's body collapse her hollow field, rendering the monofilament wire useless against projected coordinates that existed 3 meters left of her actual position. The attacker had been Drukhari, probably sent by a cabal that saw cooperation with Mon-Ki as terminal weakness. She stepped over the corpse without breaking stride, her entourage of dire avengers maintaining formation despite the sudden violence. This was why the Inari remained fractured, why every step toward collective survival had to be negotiated through layers of ancient spite and fresh contempt. Her people were dying by inches, their souls consumed by she who thirsts, and still they spent energy murdering each other over philosophical disputes. The Mon-Ki representatives waited in the Junction's central chamber, a space where reality held more stable than the Webway's usual chaos. Grey knights in full battle plate, their psychic signatures burning like balefire against her soul sight. Inquisitor Holt, his augmetic eye recording everything with the paranoid efficiency she'd learned to expect from his kind. And standing slightly apart from both, refusing to acknowledge either faction's authority the phenomenon. Madoka. Lyraethil had reviewed every scrap of intelligence the Inari network possessed on this entity. Testimonies from survivors who spoke of mercy without price. Reports from seers who claimed the warp itself recoiled from her presence. Analysis from bone singers who insisted she operated through principles that predated the fall, perhaps even the war in heaven. None of it prepared her for direct observation. The Monkey called her a girl. Lirithil, who had lived 7 centuries and watched her people's slow extinction with the patience of someone who knew exactly how many heartbeats remained before the end, recognized something older. Not in years, in purpose. A decision made so long ago, it had become woven into the fabric of what this being was. You came alone. Justicar Callistos observed his armored bulk, radiating disapproval. I came with 12 warriors. Lirithil corrected her Gothic flawless, despite the contempt she layered into each syllable. That you cannot perceive them speaks to your species' persistent inability to recognize threats until they've already killed you. Holt raised one hand, forestalling Callistos' response. We're not here to measure tactical superiority. We're here because your people want something from her, and we need to understand if that desire threatens Imperial interests. Your interests? Lirithil said, letting ancient disdain color her tone, consist primarily of maintaining authority over populations too brutalized to question it. My interests involve preventing the total extinction of the Aeldari race. I suspect we can coexist in our respective objectives if you manage not to shoot me for the next hour. She turned to Madoka, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, observing with the patient attention of someone watching a play whose ending she already knew. Their eyes met, and for one vertiginous instant, Lirithil felt something vast and infinitely gentle regard her with complete understanding. You see souls, Madoka said. Not question, statement. I see what remains when flesh fails and spirit persists. Lirithil replied carefully. I see my people's souls screaming as they're drawn into her endless appetite. I see them fighting, struggling, ultimately losing that final battle. Every single time. But you've heard the reports. Souls I retrieve leave no trace for chaos to feed on. No psychic residue. No warp current carrying them to damnation. She paused, choosing words with the precision of someone negotiating a minefield. The question my people ask is whether your intervention extends beyond Monkey. Whether Aeldari souls might also find sanctuary in whatever afterlife you offer. Madoka's expression shifted, something that might have been sadness flickering across features too young to have witnessed the horrors Lirithil described. I don't offer afterlife. I offer ending to suffering before it becomes fuel for worse things. If your people stand at that threshold, yes, I can carry them away from what hunts them. Define threshold. Holt interjected, his augmetic eye whirring as it processed the conversation. Your intervention follows specific patterns. We've documented the conditions. Despair approaching transformation, corruption at the tipping point. But Aeldari souls face consumption regardless of mental state. Does your mechanism account for that difference? It was the right question, the one that cut to the heart of why this meeting carried weight beyond diplomatic theater. Lirithil waited for the answer with the focused intensity of someone whose entire species' survival might pivot on the next few words. I don't save souls from death, Madoka said quietly. I save them from the specific transformation where suffering crystallizes into something that feeds the warp's worst aspects. For Aeldari, that transformation happens at death. Yes, because of how she who thirsts hunts you. If I'm present when an Aeldari dies, I can intercept that process. Cut the line before the hook sets. Lirithil felt something ancient and carefully suppressed stir in her chest. Hope. The emotion her people had learned to ration like water in a desert, because hope expended carelessly left you vulnerable to despair's backlash. And the cost, she asked, because nothing in this universe came free. No cost to those I carry, Madoka replied. The cost is mine. Each soul I take I carry. Their pain, their memories, their final moments. It accumulates. But that's not something you need to pay. It's something I choose to bear. The Monkey delegation shifted subtle movements that suggested this information was new to them as well. Holt's augmetic eye focused with predatory intensity, no doubt recording every word for analysis by minds that would spend years trying to weaponize what they'd learned. Callisto spoke, his voice carrying the formal weight of liturgical recitation. You claim to carry suffering. But suffering is the Imperium's currency, the Emperor's price for humanity's survival. If you remove that cost, you remove the mechanism through which faith is tested and proven. I remove the mechanism through which chaos feeds. Madoka corrected gently. Faith that requires suffering to validate itself isn't faith. It's Stockholm Syndrome with theological justification. The silence that followed held enough tension to ignite Prometheum. Lirathil watched the Monkey Justicar process what might have been the most heretical statement he'd ever heard delivered with such casual certainty. To her surprise, he didn't immediately attempt violence. Perhaps even the Grey Knights were learning that some targets defied conventional response protocols. Your people want to test this, Holt said, addressing Lirathil while keeping Madoka in his peripheral vision. That's why you requested this meeting. You have someone dying, someone whose sole fate you want to alter. Lirathil had spent 7 centuries perfecting the art of emotional control. It failed her now. We have thousands dying. Every hour, every day. The question is whether you'll permit us to bring one here to this neutral ground, to verify the claims before we commit to broader cooperation. Cooperation implies mutual benefit, Holt observed. What do the Inari offer in exchange for this intervention? Information, Lirathil said immediately. We've mapped warp current changes across 17 sectors where she's operated. Yvraine herself has examined the data. The pattern is consistent and unprecedented. When Madoka acts, the warp's local topology shifts. Not dramatically, not permanently, but for brief windows, the connection between material despair and immaterial empowerment degrades. Demons lose coherence. Possession vectors collapse. The mechanisms chaos uses to maintain real space presence become less efficient. She pulled a data crystal from her belt, its surface etched with Dari runes that pulsed with captive information. This contains our full analysis. Yvraine believes that if this effect could be scaled, controlled, weaponized, it might provide the key to breaking chaos's grip on reality itself. Not destroying the warp. That's impossible. But making it harder for the ruinous powers to leverage mortal suffering into demonic manifestation. Holt accepted the crystal, his fingers closing around it, with the careful precision of someone handling potentially explosive ordnance. And if this analysis reveals vulnerabilities in her mechanism, if it provides the Imperium or your people with methods to restrict or eliminate her, then you'll have made the same choice every faction in this galaxy eventually makes. Lirathil said, her voice dropping to registers that carried ancient sorrow. Short-term tactical advantage over long-term survival. We're all so good at it. It's why we're losing. Madoka had been watching this exchange with the patient attention of someone observing a pattern she'd seen before. Now she spoke, and her words cut through the political maneuvering like a blade through silk. You can bring your dying. I'll help if I can. But understand this, I don't serve Inari interests any more than I serve Imperial doctrine. If what I do happens to align with your survival, that's circumstance, not alliance. I'm not a weapon you can aim. I'm not a tool you can wield. I'm just someone trying to make sure people don't become fuel for monsters when they die. The simplicity of it, the absolute refusal to engage with the political frameworks both sides tried to impose, carried more weight than any threat. Lirathil recognized the pattern. This was how powers beyond conventional hierarchy operated. Not through dominance or submission, but through principles that existed orthogonal to the usual axes of loyalty and betrayal. "Bring your dying," Holt said, and Lirathil marked how he phrased it as endorsement rather than permission. Even the Inquisition was learning. "We'll observe, we'll document. And if this works, as you claim, we'll discuss what comes next." The Eldari who arrived 3 hours later was named Kalis, a dire avenger whose helmet had been removed to reveal features twisted by pain and the first stages of soul corruption. He'd been wounded in a skirmish with Drukari raiders, their weapons designed specifically to compromise spirit stone integrity. His soul was leaking, bleeding into the warp where she who thirsts waited with infinite patience and infinite hunger. Lirathil knelt beside him, her hands steady despite the grief that threatened to crack her carefully maintained composure. Kalis had been her student once, before the Inari fractured from the craft worlds, before survival became a calculus of acceptable losses. "Lyre," he whispered, his voice thin with approaching dissolution. "I can feel her. She's singing, promising things, lying about everything." "I know," Lirathil said, and hated how inadequate the words felt. 7 centuries of life, of watching her people die and worse, and she still had no comfort to offer, except this, "But there might be another way. Someone who can take you before she does." Kalis's eyes dimming as his soul light guttered, focused on Madoka with the desperate intensity of someone drowning and suddenly shown a rope. "You're the one they whisper about. The impossible thing. The mercy that asks nothing." Madoka knelt on his other side, her white dress somehow still pristine despite the webway's ambient corruption. She looked at Lirathil, and something in that gaze asked permission that she absolutely did not need to request. Lirathil nodded. Madoka placed one hand on Kalis's forehead. The effect was immediate and terrifying in its gentleness. The corruption that had been eating through his spirit stone structure simply stopped. Not reversed. Not purged. It stopped being able to advance under conditions that no longer supported its propagation. Kalis gasped, not with pain, but with sudden absence of it. I can't hear her anymore." The singing stopped. "Because you're not going where she can reach," Madoka said softly. "I'm sorry I can't make this painless, but I can make it final. No more running. No more fear. Just ending." "That's all I wanted," Kalis whispered. "That's all any of us want. Just an ending that's ours." His form began to fade, not dissolving, but becoming translucent, like he was stepping into a different spectrum of existence entirely. Lirathil watched through her soul sight as something incomprehensible happened. The thread that connected Kalis to she who thirsts, that golden line of ownership and hunger that marked every Eldari soul, simply terminated. Not cut, not broken. It ended as if it had never extended past this moment. When Kalis fully disappeared, Lirathil reached out with every sense she possessed, trying to track where he'd gone. Nothing. No warp trace. No soul echo, no screaming void where a spirit should be. He had simply stopped existing in any framework she knew how to measure. "Where?" she asked, her voice raw. "Where did you take him?" "Somewhere safe," Madoka said, and stood. "Somewhere the hungry things can't follow." Justikar Callistos had been monitoring through psychic and technological means simultaneously. His armor's machine spirit registered the event. His own psyker-trained perception catalogued impossible readings. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone reporting a miracle while maintaining doctrinal skepticism. Confirmed cessation of subject's material presence. No warp signature indicating demonic consumption. No soul trace remaining for analysis. Classification outside established parameters. Holt's augmetic eye had recorded everything. Now he turned to Retell, and she saw calculation behind his expression. You've witnessed what you came to verify. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge? I returned to Ivrain. Retell said, her mind already racing ahead through implications and consequences. I report that the claims are verified, that Aeldari's souls can be preserved from she who thirsts through this entity's intervention. And then we discuss whether salvation through dependence on an uncontrollable Monkey phenomenon is better or worse than extinction through attrition. Your people won't accept it, Holt predicted. Too much pride, too much history. The idea that Xenos survival might depend on something aligned with Imperial interests, however loosely, will spark internal conflict. My people, Retell said bitterly, have been in internal conflict since the fall. This is just another fracture in a race already shattered beyond repair. But some of us still remember why survival matters more than pride. She gathered her entourage with a gesture preparing to depart. But before she left, she turned to Madoka one final time. Thank you, she said, and meant it despite centuries of conditioning that insisted gratitude toward lesser species was weakness. Kalis deserved peace. We all do. Everyone does. Madoka replied simply. That's why I'm here. The intelligence brief reached Holt's data slate 4 hours after the Inari departed. Encrypted at maximum classification, coded with markers that indicated Mechanicus origin. Anomalous readings. Sarkov Vault Sector metallic signatures. Necron Tier, origin confirmed probability analysis. 94.7% certainty of tomb awakening correlation. Warp quieting zones match. Subject operation locations. Holt read it twice, then activated Secure Vox to Callistos. Justikar, we have a problem. Define problem. Callistos replied, his voice filtered through armor systems. The Xenos who don't need the warp are waking up. And they're waking up in exactly the regions where she's been most active. The silence on the Vox carried weight. Both men understood the implications. Necrons didn't wake randomly. They woke when they detected specific conditions, threats, or opportunities. If they were stirring in response to Madoka's presence, it meant they'd classified her as something worth investigating. Holt began composing his report to Ultramar, knowing this would escalate priorities considerably. Eldar seeking salvation was containable. Necrons conducting analysis was potentially catastrophic. The ancient machines had spent 60 million years perfecting the art of reducing cosmic-level problems to their component elements. If they decided Madoka represented a threat to their long-term plans, no amount of Imperial protection would prevent them from attempting termination. And if they decided she represented an opportunity, they'd try to capture and weaponize her with the same cold efficiency they applied to all technical problems. Either outcome would force the Imperium's hand in ways Holt wasn't prepared to recommend. Outside the Veilglass Junction in the vast dark between stars, something ancient felt the ripples of change and began its own calculations. Tomb complexes that had slept since before humanity learned to work metal started preliminary wake cycles. Cryptex, whose minds operated on timescales measured in geological epochs, reviewed new data and found it Interesting. The galaxy's oldest players were taking notice. The game was becoming more complicated. Son, in the underhive of the world called Gauss Tertius, something unexpected happened. An orc war boss named Grim Tusk, who had been preparing to launch a wah against Imperial positions, heard about the pink humiwat makes to fight and stop. His response was immediate and visceral. "Dat's on Orky. If she's stopping Gud scraps, we gotta find some fin better to fight." The wah redirected. Not toward Madoka, but toward a Death Guard warband that had been spreading plague across 3 subsectors. Grim Tusk had decided that fightin' dem rusty gits what don't even bleed propa was more worthy of his boys' attention than Humies who had a stop fightin' grot making things boring. The tactical implications escaped Orc's strategic thinking, but the outcome was measurable. 3 Imperial worlds received unexpected reprieve as greenskin aggression found new targets. Lord Varan's staff marked it as an anomaly, then quietly adjusted deployment schedules to exploit the opening. No one officially connected it to Madoka. The orcs certainly didn't. They just knew there were better fights available, and DeBoss said so, and that was enough. Meanwhile, in the void between systems, Tyranid hive fleets continued their advance, with the implacable patience of hunger-given form. The shadow and the warp that preceded them operated on principles entirely separate from chaos mechanics. Madoka's interventions affected suffering as fuel. The Tyranids didn't feed on suffering. They fed on biomass. Different hunger, different darkness, different rules. The galaxy was teaching a lesson it had taught countless times before solving one existential threat rarely addressed the others. Sometimes it just changed which monsters you faced. Then, Inquisitor Holt reviewed the data from multiple sources trying to identify patterns that made sense. Inari reports. Mechanicus analysis. Orc behavioral anomalies. Necron tomb activations. Each piece told a story, but he couldn't quite see how they fit together. What he did know, Madoka's presence was creating ripples far beyond Imperial borders. Factions that hadn't cared about human affairs in millennia were suddenly paying attention. The question was whether that attention would manifest as alliance opposition, or something the Imperium had no framework to predict. His report to Guilliman grew longer, more complex, more uncertain. Every answer generated 3 new questions. Every pattern revealed deeper mysteries. Finally, he reduced it to one sentence that would either prompt action or mark him as hysteric. The galaxy is reorganizing itself around an anomaly we cannot control, and our current doctrine provides no adequate response protocols. He encrypted it, marked it for Guilliman's eyes only, and sent it into the void. Somewhere in spaces between spaces, ancient minds received similar data and began planning responses that would make the Imperium's scrambling look like children playing at war. The age of certainty was ending. What came next would test every faction's ability to adapt. And in the center of it all, a girl in white walked through darkness, completely unaware that her simple choice to help the suffering had just shifted the galaxy's fundamental power structures. Things just got way more complicated. Now the Eldar are showing up because they want a piece of this miracle too. It is such a huge deal to see Madoka save an Elder's soul from a dark god because that has been impossible for millions of years. I'm thinking that Madoka is basically breaking the economy of the galaxy. She is giving away peace for free, and the big empires hate that because they can't use it as a weapon. But guys need to watch out, because now the Necrons are waking up, because she is messing with the math of space. It feels like every big player is starting to panic because they can't control her. If If you were an Eldar, would you take her deal and vanish to a safe place? Or maybe that's just too risky. The pocket opened like a wound in reality, but clean. No warp taint. No bleeding corruption. Just a sudden elsewhere carved into the space between Madoka's intention and the universe's fabric. Inquisitor Holt's instruments registered it as impossible geometry angles that shouldn't exist, converging into a sphere of causality approximately 3 kilometers in diameter. Inside sunlight, ordinary, the kind that fell on worlds where people lived without knowing demons existed. "What is this?" Justicar Callistos demanded, his armor's machine spirits howling warnings about reality violations. "Home," Madoka said quietly. "Or a memory of it. I need to remember why this matters before I forget." She stepped through. Holt made the decision in milliseconds following before the opening could close. Callistos came after his nemesis, force weapon drawn, despite recognizing the futility. If she wanted them dead distance, and weapons made no difference. The landscape inside defied 40k's aesthetic entirely. Clean streets, intact buildings, civilians walking without fear, without the permanent tension that marked Imperial citizens who'd learned to expect death from above. A girl in a school uniform laughed at something her friend said, the sound carrying crystal clarity that made Holt's augmetic eyes struggle to process data it had never been calibrated to record. Joy. Uncomplicated. Free. "This is heresy," Callistos whispered, but the word lacked conviction. He'd spent 2 centuries defending humanity and seeing what humanity could look like without constant siege warfare stripped away certainties he'd built his existence upon. Madoka walked down a familiar street, her steps slowing as she approached a modest house with a small garden. The door opened before she reached it. A woman emerged, middle-aged, kind-faced, ordinary, in every way, except the shimmer at her edges, that suggested this wasn't quite flesh anymore. "Mom," Madoka said, and for the first time since Holt had started observing her, she sounded young, vulnerable, human in ways that terrified him more than any display of power could. The woman, the construct, the memory given temporary form, smiled with maternal warmth that felt alien in a galaxy where parents learned to ration affection because children died too easily. "You came back. I was starting to worry." "I had to see you one more time," Madoka said, "before it gets too loud to hear myself think. Before I forget what peace feels like." She embraced the construct, and Holt watched through sensors designed to detect deception. This wasn't manipulation. This was need, raw and desperate, the kind that drove soldiers to carry photographs of families they'd never see again. Then the edges began to fray. Not rapidly. Gradually. Like frost spreading across glass. The sky at the pocket's periphery started showing cracks, and through those cracks, something vast and hungry pressed inward with the patient malevolence of predators who'd learned to wait. Chaos had found her anchor point. Of course it had. Hope this pure burned like a beacon in the warp's depths. Callistos saw it through his psychic senses first. Contamination vectors incoming, multiple signatures. They're not trying to break through. They're trying to corrupt what's already here. Madoka released her mother construct, turning to face the corrupting edges with expression gone cold. Not angry, just resolved. "I knew it wouldn't last. Nothing does when they find it." The garden began to wither. Not dying, transforming. Flowers bloomed in colors that hurt to perceive their beauty twisted into something that promised pleasure and delivered only addiction's hollow craving. The laughter from nearby streets took on mocking undertones. Joy curdled into the kind of hysteria that preceded total breakdown. Holt recognized the pattern. Slaanesh's touch specifically. The Prince of Pleasure specializing in taking beautiful things and making them obscene. You need to close this, he said, his tactical assessment overriding sentiment. If they corrupt your home memory, they gain leverage. Psychological ammunition you can't afford to give them. I know, Madoka replied, her voice steady, despite watching paradise rot. That's why I'm sealing it now, while there's still something worth preserving. She placed both hands against the air, and Holt felt reality respond. The pocket began collapsing inward, not violently, but deliberately. Controlled demolition, saving what could be saved and cutting away what chaos had already touched. Her mother construct faded last, dissolving into light, with a final smile that suggested understanding. Do what you need to do, sweetheart. We'll always be here in the parts they can't reach. Then nothing. The pocket closed. They stood in the regular universe again on a Necron tomb world surface where Holt's instruments had tracked the anomaly. The transition was jarring, going from sunlight and safety to the cold mathematics of Xenos architecture designed to outlast eternity. Madoka stood motionless for 7 heartbeats, her shoulders tight with grief she wouldn't voice. When she spoke, her tone carried steel that hadn't been there before. They'll use it anyway. The memory. They'll try to twist what I saw into something that serves them. That's how they work. Yes, Holt confirmed, because lying served no purpose. The ruinous powers excel at weaponizing sentiment. They'll construct narratives around your home memory. Make it a story about paradise lost or sanctuary that breeds weakness or proof that hope always ends in corruption. Whatever version generates the most despair. Then I need to define it first, Madoka said, before their interpretation becomes the one people believe. The broadcast reached 17 sectors simultaneously. Using every Vox channel and data stream the Imperium hadn't managed to lock down. Not hacking, not force. Just walking through digital barriers the same way she walked through demon lines operating on principles that made encryption irrelevant. Madoka's image appeared on screens across war zones and factory planets under hives and noble spires. No dramatic staging, no religious iconography. Just her speaking with a kind of direct honesty that made propaganda specialists across the Imperium begin drafting counter-narratives before she finished her first sentence. My name is Madoka Kaname. You've called me Saint Weapon Heresy Miracle. I'm none of those. I'm someone trying to prevent suffering from becoming fuel for the things that feed on it. She paused, letting that sink in. Holt watched the broadcast from his command center, already calculating the damage this would inflict on carefully maintained information control. I've seen what happens when people lose hope. How despair crystallizes into forms that give the warp's worst entities purchase in your reality. I intercept that process. I take souls at the moment before transformation, carrying them to places the hungry things can't follow. Another pause. Her expression shifted, vulnerability showing through. I had a home once, a place where people could laugh without checking shadows for threats. I tried to visit it to remember what I'm fighting for. Chaos found it immediately, started corrupting it, turning my memories into weapons they could use against everyone who's ever felt homesick in this galaxy. The admission of weakness should have undermined her. Instead, it made her more credible. People across 17 sectors who'd learned to distrust authorities' polished lies recognized authentic pain when they heard it. So they'll tell you I'm dangerous. That hope I offer leads to corruption. That remembering peace makes you vulnerable. They'll take my grief and weaponize it into reasons why you should accept suffering as inevitable. Her eyes in close-up, they held depths. that made even recorded video feel like direct contact focused with laser precision. Don't believe them. Suffering isn't holy. It's not the Emperor's price or chaos's due. It's just suffering. The Imperium uses it because they've forgotten any other way. Chaos feeds on it because that's their nature. But you don't owe either of them your pain. She let that heresy hang in the air for 3 seconds. Somewhere Cardinal Vale was probably having an apoplectic fit. I can't save everyone. I can't prevent all death or eliminate all hardship. What I can do is make sure that when you die as yourself. Not fuel, not corruption, not a scream that echoes through the warp feeding monsters. Just yourself. An ending that belongs to you. The broadcast ended. No dramatic conclusion, no call to action. Just the cessation of transmission. In the silence that followed, Holt recognized what she'd done. Not propaganda. Anti-propaganda. She'd claimed her own narrative before others could define it for her, using vulnerability as armor against manipulation. The Chaos Gods would still try to corrupt the message. The Imperium would still attempt to suppress it. But she'd established baseline truth that both sides would now have to argue against, and arguing against someone who admitted weakness while offering help was significantly harder than arguing against someone claiming perfection. His vox crackled. Lord Varen's voice tight with controlled fury. Tell me you have a plan to contain this. No, Holt said simply. Containment assumes we control the narrative. We don't. She just claimed it. Our options now are adapt or eliminate. Elimination, Varen asked, letting the question dangle, would require forces we don't possess and acceptance of consequences we can't predict. She's not threatening us. She's threatening our monopoly on hope's definition. Those aren't the same thing. Before Varen could respond, Holt's instruments registered incoming data marked with Ultramar's encryption. He opened it, scanning content that made his augmetic eye stutter through processing cycles. Directive from Roboot Guilliman. 2-layer structure, the kind used when official policy diverged from practical necessity. Layer 1. Official phenomenon designated Subject Pink to be monitored, not confronted. Imperial forces maintain observation protocols. No hostile action without Lord Commander authorization. Layer 2. Restricted. If subject demonstrates capacity to preserve human souls from warp consumption without Emperor's intercession, investigate potential for strategic application. However, be prepared to terminate if evidence suggests alternative soul processing creates dependencies that undermine Imperial authority. We cannot afford salvation that requires worshipping someone other than him on Terra. The contradiction was elegant. Protect her utility while preparing to destroy the moment she threatened hierarchy. Guilliman understood the real war not against chaos, but against any framework that made the Imperium's brutal necessity look optional. Holt encrypted his response, acknowledged. Termination protocols on standby. Current assessment subject represents ideological threat more than tactical. Chaos attempting definition warfare. Recommend we observe how she counters before committing resources. In the warp's screaming depths, 4 powers convened in the space where their domains intersected and warred. Not the gods themselves, they were too vast, too absolute to communicate in anything resembling dialogue. But fragments, aspects, demons, powerful enough to speak with their masters' voices. Kairos Thoughtweaver, Oracle of Zinch, analyzed probability branches. She resists nomenclature. Every name we apply, she redefines from within. Saint becomes personal choice rather than divine appointment. Weapon transforms into autonomous moral actor. Even threat she's reframed as threat to exploitation rather than existence. A great unclean one representing Nurgle wheezed laughter through decaying lungs. Let her resist. Resistance breeds exhaustion. She carries every soul she takes. The weight accumulates. Eventually she'll collapse under burdens she chose to bear and will be there when she falls. Scarbrand Khorne's eternal fury given form cared nothing for subtle manipulation. Kill her. Destroy her. End the variable that doesn't play by our rules. Can't south, the Fate Weaver observed clinically. She exists orthogonal to our conventional kill mechanisms. Direct assault fails. We've already tested this through proxies. She doesn't fight. She negates. Renders our violence inapplicable through conditions that reject its premises. From Slaaneş's realm, a keeper of secrets hissed observation. Then corrupt what she loves. Her home memory tasted of such sweetness. Imagine what we could make of it. Show her paradise rotting. Make her grief into chains, heavier than any we could forge from malice. Already attempted, Fate Weaver noted. She closed the pocket before full corruption, sealed away her anchor rather than let us weaponize it. The gesture cost her, though. We felt the pain. She's increasingly isolated from sources of comfort. The four demon aspects considered this. Isolation bred desperation. Desperation crystallized into the exact conditions where mortals became vulnerable to their influence. Continue definition warfare, the Fate Weaver concluded. Frame her actions through lenses that serve us. When mortals call her savior, we whisper, false god. When they see mercy, we suggest weakness that invites predation. When they witness hope, we remind them hope delayed is suffering prolonged. And if she continues to redefine faster than we can corrupt, the Nurgle demon asked, then we make her carry the universe's pain until the weight crushes her humanity. She claims to bear suffering for others. Let's see how many billion souls she can carry before she forgets what it meant to be the girl who chose this path. Done. The Necron delegation materialized without warning, phasing through ship hulls and void shields as if they were decorative suggestions rather than actual barriers. Cryptek Tekmet, the lattice scribe, led 3 Lich Guard, their Gauss weaponry powered down, but ready. A courtesy that felt more like threat than diplomacy. They found Madoka on the Veil Glass Junction's observation deck watching stars through Wraith Bone-reinforced viewports. She didn't turn when they arrived, but her posture shifted. Acknowledgement without alarm. You've been calculating, she said, statement rather than question. Tekmet's vocal synthesizer produced sounds that approximated Gothic, though the underlying mathematical harmonics suggested translation from something far more complex. 60 million years. We've existed 60 million years. We've seen empires rise and fall, watched gods birth themselves from collective belief, observed entropy's gradual victory over all ordered systems. He gestured with one metallic hand, and holographic projections filled the air. Data streams showing warp pattern changes, soul trajectory alterations, mathematical models of reality's fabric under stress. You represent an anomaly. Local warp topology shifts wherever you operate. The connection between material suffering and immaterial empowerment degrades in your presence. This is not power. This is structural modification of fundamental universal constants. And you want to stabilize it, Madoka said, still not turning. Lock it in place. Make it predictable. Incorrect. Tekmet's tone carried what might have been amusement and something capable of emotion. We want to contain it. Prevent cascade effects. You alter reality's rules wherever you go. Uncheck that alteration spreads. Eventually it reaches thresholds where universal constants become variables. Heat death accelerates. Entropy wins faster. Now she turned meeting the cryptech's glowing eye sensors with steady regard. You're afraid I'll accidentally destroy the universe trying to save it. We're certain you will give insufficient time and scale. Not through malice, through geometric progression of unintended consequences. Each soul you save creates ripple effects. Those ripples intersect, amplify, generate feedback loops. The mathematics are clear. Madoka's expression held sorrow. The Tech-Met's emotion processors registered as genuine, despite his species' abandonment of such concepts. Then what do you propose? Voluntary confinement. We construct a tesseract prison comfortable, humane by your species' standards, but isolated from real space. You continue your work within controlled parameters. Souls enter, receive your intervention, exit to wherever you send them. But your reality-altering presence remains quarantined from the broader universe. A box, Madoka said softly. A very nice box, but still a box. Yes. And if I refuse? Tech-Met's pause suggested calculation occurring across processing architecture that operated faster than human neurons could dream. Then we implement termination protocols designed to collapse your local causality bubble, erasing you from the timeline. Not death. Retroactive non-existence. Every soul you've saved remains saved, but the you that saved them never was. That's not possible, Justakar Callistos interjected, having been observing from the deck's entrance. Causality doesn't work that way. Incorrect. Causality works exactly that way if you possess sufficient understanding of the underlying mathematics and technology capable of exploiting temporal vulnerabilities, as Hibday says. We do. She knows this. Madoka nodded slowly. You're serious. You'd erase me to preserve universal stability. Without hesitation. Our species survived the war in heaven by recognizing existential threats and neutralizing them before cascade failure. You are the most sophisticated existential threat we've encountered in 60 million years, precisely because you don't mean to be. The silence stretched. Outside stars burned with the indifferent patience of fusion processes that would outlast all organic concerns. Finally, Madoka spoke. How long do I have to decide? Subjective measurement, 96 hours. Objective measurement until you trigger sufficient cascade effects that our predictive models indicate intervention becomes mandatory. Whichever comes first. The Necrons phased out as abruptly as they'd arrived, leaving behind quantum uncertainty and the cold certainty of species who'd turned pragmatism into an art form, spanning geological epochs. Callistos approached carefully. They're bluffing. They can't actually erase you from causality. They're not bluffing, Madoka said. And yes, they can. I've seen the math in their calculations. It works. They really would kill me to save the universe from my help. Banan. Then what will you do? She turned to face him fully, and Callistos saw something he hadn't observed before. Exhaustion. Not physical. The kind that came from carrying weight that kept increasing no matter how strong you were. I'm going to keep going, she said quietly. Because even if they're right, even if I eventually break something fundamental in reality, the alternative is letting people become fuel for monsters. I can't accept that. I won't. Even knowing the cost. Especially knowing the cost. That's what makes it matter. Tuna, aboard the Righteous Confession. Astropath Maris Cade screamed, not from pain, from contact, Something vast had brushed against her consciousness during routine astronomican communion, and that something had transmitted a message she couldn't refuse or ignore. When she recovered enough to speak, Cardinal Vale's interrogators crowded close recording devices active. "What did you see?" Vale demanded. "What touched you? Him?" Cade whispered, her voice raw. "The Emperor. He's watching her. He sees what she's doing." And Cade's hands shook as she tried to form words adequate to the vision. He didn't speak in language, just impression, feeling, warning, and hope tangled together. "Specify." Vale pressed his patience eroding. "He wants her protected. She represents possibility. He can't create a lone salvation without his throne's power structure. But he also fears her. Fears what happens if mortals learn they don't need him to escape damnation." She looked up at Vael with eyes that had seen something they'd never unsee. He's caught between wanting her to succeed and needing her to fail. And that contradiction is tearing through the warp like a knife, because he can't reconcile divine will with divine necessity. Vael absorbed this, his theological framework creaking under implications that threatened to collapse entire doctrinal structures. If the Emperor himself was uncertain, what did that mean for the Church built on his supposed absolute authority? "This information goes nowhere," he said finally. "Sealed at maximum classification. Anyone who heard it takes memory suppressants. We cannot afford doubt at the foundation level." But doubt once introduced metastasized. The interrogators had heard. Cade knew. And somewhere in the warp's currents, the Emperor's contradiction rippled outward, creating eddies that would eventually disturb surfaces across the galaxy. Madoka sat alone in her quarters aboard the Veil Glass Junction, listening to voices only she could hear. Not the Chaos Gods. Not manipulation or corruption. Just the souls she'd carried. Billions now. Each one a memory, a final moment, a burden she'd taken on herself. They didn't demand anything. Didn't accuse. They just were present, persistent, accumulating like snow that never melted. She closed her eyes, trying to remember silence, the kind she'd known in her original world before taking on a responsibility that spanned galaxies. But silence was gone. In its place, whispers. Not malicious, just constant. The price she'd agreed to pay, and it was getting heavier. Somewhere in the distant dark Necrons calculated termination windows. In the warp's depths, chaos refined its definition warfare. Across Imperial space, humanity debated whether she represented salvation or its opposite. And at the center of it all, a girl who'd chosen to carry suffering. So others wouldn't have to wondering if eventually the weight would break her before she could finish what she'd started. The answer she suspected was yes. But knowing that didn't change the choice. She'd keep going until she couldn't anymore. Because that's what the choice meant. The Great Rift location was designated Sundered Choir, a wound in real space where reality's membrane had torn so completely that maintaining coherent matter required active willpower. Ships avoided it. Navigators refused routes within 3 sectors. Even demons manifested cautiously here, where the warp's physics became unpredictable enough to threaten their own coherence. Madoka entered alone. Justicar Callistos watched from the observation deck of the strike cruiser Adamant Truth, his armor's sensors tracking her descent into the maelstrom. No protective field, no vessel, just walking into screaming unreality as if it were merely another threshold to cross. She's insane. Lord Varen muttered, his augmetic fingers drumming against the tactical display. Even assuming she survives entry, the warp pressure at that depth will crush causality itself. Time stops meaning anything. Space becomes suggestion rather than fact. She knows, Inquisitor Holt said quietly, reviewing data streams that showed impossible readings. That's why she chose this location, maximum warp density, where the barrier between material and immaterial essentially doesn't exist. If she's going to rewrite fundamental rules, she needs access to the substrate where those rules are written. On screen, Madoka's form began to distort, stretched across dimensions human optics couldn't properly render. Then, she disappeared entirely, passing into spectrums where conventional observation failed. Inside the rift. Time lost linear properties. Madoka experienced the next moments/hours/eternities as simultaneous overlapping states, each one bleeding into the others with synesthetic intensity that would have shattered mortal minds. The Chaos Gods noticed her immediately. Of course they did. She'd walked into their domain with intention clear enough to ring like cathedral bells across the Imperium. They didn't manifest directly. Too vast for that, their essence distributed across reality's fabric in ways that made location meaningless. But fragments came, aspects, pieces sufficiently concentrated to communicate while maintaining coherent identity. 4 voices spoke as one, their words layered with harmonics that carried meaning beyond language. You dare enter our realm bearing laws we did not author. Madoka stood or existed, space being optional here in the center of screaming infinity. Around her souls spiraled past in endless procession, their forms twisted by the consumption that awaited them. Fuel for eternal engines. Screams that never ended, because ending would mean release. I'm not asking permission, she said, her voice carrying across impossible distances, despite speaking at normal volume. I'm implementing change. You've had long enough to prove you can't help yourselves, so I'm removing the option. The voices laughed, sound that would have peeled flesh from bone in real space. You think we fear you? We who have consumed galaxies worth of mortal terror. We who fed on suffering before your species crawled from primordial seas. I don't need you to fear me, Madoka replied. I just need you to starve. She raised both hands, and the gesture carried weight that bent reality around it. Not force, legislation. The imposition of rules onto chaos that had existed without constraint since the warp's formation. I declare lex misericordiae, the law of mercy, effective immediately across all spaces where suffering approaches transformation into your fuel. The warp convulsed, not violently, fundamentally, as if the universe itself was adjusting to accommodate a principle that had never existed in its architecture before. The law functions as follows. Any sentient being who reaches the threshold where despair crystallizes into warp fuel will be intercepted. Their soul removed from the cycle before consumption. Carried to places you cannot reach by mechanisms you cannot corrupt. The 4 aspects surged forward, attempting to crush her through sheer presence. She didn't resist, didn't fight back. Just stood there, letting their malice wash over her like water over stone, demonstrating through stillness that violence was inapplicable. This is theft, the voices howled. You steal what is rightfully ours. The despairing have always been our due. You break covenant older than stars. There was never a covenant, Madoka said. Just your hunger and their suffering. That's not agreement. That's predation. And I'm ending it. She could feel the weight now. Billions of souls she'd already carried, plus the infinite stream she was now committing to intercept. The burden would grow without limit, accumulating across time and space, until eventually, inevitably, it exceeded any capacity to bear. But that was future cost. Present necessity demanded action. Lex misericordiae is enacted. Despair will no longer feed you. Suffering stops being your sustenance. Find other fuel or starve. The law locked into place, not through power but through simple existence. She'd stated it clearly enough in a location where statement became reality, and now it ran. Automatic, irrevocable. A fundamental constant joining gravity entropy and the speed of light. The chaos aspects screamed. Not in defeat, they were too vast to be defeated by single action, but in recognition. Their primary fuel source had just been legislated away, and while they possessed other methods of feeding, none matched the efficiency of harvested despair. Madoka felt the first wave of intercepted souls arrive. Thousands, then millions. The law was working, reaching across the galaxy to claim everyone who stood at that threshold moment. Their voices joined the chorus she carried, adding to the weight that would never decrease. She closed her eyes, accepting the burden. This is what the choice meant. This is what love required when facing cosmic-scale horror. Not victory, just unending commitment to carrying others' pain so they wouldn't have to become monsters' food. The warp began to change around her, quieting locally. The connection between mortal suffering and immaterial empowerment degrading as her law took effect. Demons started losing coherence, their manifestation vectors collapsing without steady fuel supply. In the material galaxy, consequences rippled outward faster than light. Aboard the Adamant Truth, every astropath simultaneously convulsed. The warp had just shifted phase, and psychers felt it like needles through their souls. Navigator Lysa Bellasan, guiding the ship through real space near the rift's edge, shrieked as her third eye registered impossible readings. The currents are wrong. The Astronomican's light is fragmenting, no refracting. I can still see it, but the path there no longer follows predictable geometry. Holt's instruments went haywire, sensors struggling to process data that violated their calibration assumptions. Report. What's happening to the warp's topology? It's quieting, one of the astropaths gasped, blood streaming from her nose. The screaming is stopping. Not silent. Just less. Demons are losing purchase. The mechanisms they use to maintain real space presence are failing. Callistos felt it through his psychic attunement. The background corruption that saturated 40,000 reality like radiation was suddenly less intense. Not gone. Reduced. As if someone had turned down the warp's volume by several decibels. She did it, he whispered. She actually rewrote the rules. At what cost? Varen demanded. Navigator, can you plot warp jumps under these conditions? Bellasan tried her augmented perception, straining to map routes that no longer obeyed familiar patterns. Maybe the paths exist, but they're uncertain, unstable. I could get us to our destination, or 3 sectors away, or nowhere at all. Warp travel just became probability gambling instead of navigable science. The implications crashed down on everyone present. The Imperium's entire logistics network depended on predictable warp travel. Reinforcements, supply lines, communication between worlds. If the warp had become too quiet to navigate reliably, the galaxy just fragmented into isolated pockets. Holt's Vox crackled with emergency broadcasts from 17 sectors. Imperial forces reporting demon incursions collapsing mid-battle. Chaos cultists experiencing sudden disconnect from their patron gods. Possessed individuals spontaneously reverting to baseline humanity as the entities riding them lost sustenance. And in the silence between transmissions, a different sound. Distant. growing. The roar of orcs, whose wah no longer faced demon opposition. The chittering advance of tyrannids, whose shadow in the warp now operated against a quieter background, making them harder to detect. Madoka had starved chaos, but nature abhorred vacuum. Other threats previously secondary now filled the space left by receding demonic presence. The galaxy wasn't becoming safer, just differently dangerous. On Craftworld Iyanden Spirit Seer, Uriel felt a soul pass into Infinity Circuit who shouldn't have been possible to save. A warrior who died in battle against Drukari, whose spirit stone had been shattered by deliberate malice. By all laws governing Ildari existence, that soul should have been devoured instantly. Instead, it arrived, whole, unmarked by she who thirsts. Within hours, reports flooded in from across the craft world. Deaths that should have resulted in consumption were somehow being intercepted. Not all, not even most, but enough to notice, enough to hope. Uriel composed an urgent message to Inari leadership. The impossible has become measurable. Recommend immediate investigation into the transmission never completed. Necron forces phased into Iyanden's core, bypassing shields that couldn't stop technology operating on quantum principles. Cryptek Techmet led them, his form radiating cold purpose. The agreement is now mandatory, he stated, his vocal synthesizer rendering gothic without inflection. You wanted salvation from she who thirsts. You have it. Now comes payment. Massive tesseract structures materialized around the craft world's Infinity Circuit technology designed to contain gods, making short work of Ildari's soul architecture. Within minutes, every saved Ildari soul found itself locked in Necron custody, safe from chaos, imprisoned in living metal. Uriel drew his spear, knowing the futility. This is theft. We never agreed to. You did. Techmet interrupted. You accepted intervention from an external source. We are merely ensuring the intervention remains stable, controlled, and doesn't cascade into universal destabilization. Your souls are preserved. Their freedom is negotiable pending our completion of predictive modeling. The Necrons phased out as abruptly as they'd arrived, leaving Iyanden's leadership staring at containment fields they couldn't breach. Saved from one eternal predator, delivered to another who operated on 60 million year timescales. The irony was cold comfort. In the underhive of a world called Praxis, Tertius Imperial Guard forces cornered a group of civilians whose only crime was speaking about the broadcast. The one where Madoka claimed her own story. The one that suggested suffering wasn't holy. Commissar Vors read the charges with mechanical efficiency. Heretical doctrine, undermining imperial morale, spreading seditious propaganda that questions the Emperor's divine plan. Sentence, immediate execution. The civilians, 12 of them ranging from an old woman to a teenager, stood against the wall without protest. They'd known this was coming. The Ministorum had been purging anyone who repeated Madoka's words with approval. Any final prayers to the God Emperor? Vors asked, bolt pistol already raised. The old woman spoke, her voice carrying steady certainty. We don't need to pray. When we die, someone will carry us away. Someone who doesn't demand worship first. Vors pulled the trigger. 12 bolt rounds, 12 bodies collapsing. Quick deaths. Professional. But afterward, checking the corpses for any signs of warp taint that might indicate possession, his instruments registered something odd. No soul traces. The psychic residue that accompanied violent death was simply absent, as if the souls had departed the instant before termination, rather than lingering as they should. He reported it up the command chain, flagged as anomaly requiring investigation. Similar reports flooded in from across Imperial space. Executions that somehow failed to generate the fear and suffering that chaos typically harvested. People dying with expressions suggesting peace rather than terror. The Imperium was winning its purges in the tactical sense. But strategically, they were proving Madoka's point. You could kill the believers, but you couldn't prevent the belief from being true. Robert Guillemot received Holt's final report in his Stratagem on Macragge, surrounded by tactical displays showing a galaxy reorganizing itself in real time. Warp travel degraded to 40% reliability. Chaos incursions down 73%, but Orc-Wag activity up 150%. Tyrannid advance 200% acceleration due to reduced daemon interference. Imperial supply lines fragmenting. Morale spiking in some sectors, collapsing in others. And in the center of every calculation, one variable the Imperium couldn't control, predict, or eliminate without triggering consequences they couldn't model. Guillemot read Holt's summary 3 times before accepting its implications. She won by rewriting victory's definition. Chaos isn't defeated, they're merely starving on reduced fuel. But our logistics depend on warp currents that her law destabilized. We traded demon incursions for navigational uncertainty and Xenos opportunism. He looked at the broader strategic projection. Imperial territory fragmenting into isolated clusters. Sectors that couldn't reliably coordinate. Worlds that might go years without reinforcement, depending on navigator luck. The Imperium, 10,000 years of necessity, just learned it was built on assumptions someone could change. We either adapt to a quieter warp, or we collapse trying to maintain systems designed for the old rules. His gene-enhanced mind ran through scenarios. None ended well. Adaptation meant acknowledging Madoka's intervention as permanent building doctrine around her law, rather than the Emperor's throne. Resistance meant fighting a war against mathematical certainty, while the galaxy's other threats exploited Imperial division. Finally, he composed his directive. Not to Holt, to every Lord Commander. Chapter Master and Sector Command across what remained of connected Imperial space. Directive Primaris. Phenomenon designated Subject Pink has implemented changes to warp mechanics that appear irreversible. Imperial forces are to adapt to new navigational parameters. Do not attempt to interfere with Subject's operations. She is not allied with us, but opposing her serves no tactical purpose. He paused before adding the final line. The Emperor protects, but protection takes many forms. Some we recognize, some we don't. Survive first, understand later. Madoka emerged from the sundered choir 3 days after entering through time's meaning in that space made duration questionable. She looked unchanged, same white dress, same gentle expression, but those with psychic sensitivity could see the weight. Billions more souls than when she'd entered. The law was working, intercepting despair before chaos could feast. And she carried every one. Their voices, memories, final moments, all accumulating in a burden that would never lighten. Callisto's met her at the hangar bay, his expression unreadable behind his helmet. You succeeded. The warp is quieter. Demon incursions are collapsing across 17 sectors. Chaos is starving. Yes, Madoka said simply. The Imperium is fragmenting. Warp travel has become unreliable. Orcs and Tyrannids are filling the vacuum chaos left behind. Millions will die in wars that only started because you removed our primary existential threat. I know. The Necrons are imprisoning Eldari souls you saved, trading one captivity for another. I noticed. Callistos' voice hardened. Was it worth it? All this disruption, all these unintended consequences just to starve some demons who'll probably find alternative food sources eventually anyway. Madoka looked at him and her eyes held depths he'd never quite gotten used to. Every soul I intercept no longer becomes fuel for eternal torment. Every person who dies at that threshold gets an ending that's theirs, not a scream feeding monsters. Yes, it's worth it. All of it. Forever. Even knowing the Imperium will eventually try to kill you for what you've done. They already tried. They'll try again. That's what systems do when something threatens their necessity. But I'm not doing this for the Imperium's approval. I'm doing it because it's right. She walked past him, heading toward the ship's observation deck. Callistos watched her go, a figure in white carrying infinite weight, completely alone, despite being surrounded by billions of voices only she could hear. In the warp's depths, the Chaos Gods recalculated, searching for new fuel sources, new angles of attack, new ways to corrupt the law she'd written. They were vast, patient, and endlessly adaptable. This was setback, not defeat. Across the galaxy, the orcs roared with joy at new enemies to fight. The Tyranids advanced with implacable hunger. The Necrons woke from million-year slumbers, sensing opportunity and destabilized galactic balance. And in the quiet spaces between stars, people died. Some in battle, some in peace, some in despair that would have fed chaos, but instead found interception. Each one carried away by someone who'd chosen to bear their suffering, rather than let it become ammunition for hell. The war continued. It had never been about ending war, just changing who carried the cost. In the ruins of a hive world called Mortuus Sanctum, a dying soldier whispered final prayers, not to the Emperor, to someone who'd promised an ending that belonged to the dying, not to the predators waiting to feed. She arrived. White dress untouched by the ash falling around them, expression holding infinite gentleness and infinite sorrow. "It's okay," she said quietly, kneeling beside him. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm here to carry you away." His eyes met hers, recognition without understanding. "Are you an angel?" "No, just someone who made a choice, and I'll keep making it, no matter how heavy it gets." She touched his forehead. The pain stopped. Not because it ceased to exist, but because she took it with her, adding his burden to the billions already carried. When he faded, his expression suggested peace. She stood looking at the burning sky, listening to voices that never stopped. Somewhere the Imperium plotted her termination. The Chaos Gods refined their corruption attempts. The Necrons calculated containment protocols. None of it mattered. They could scheme for eternity. She'd keep intercepting despair before it crystallized. Keep carrying souls to safety. Keep denying hell its fuel. That's what love meant when facing a galaxy designed for suffering. Not victory, not triumph. Just unending commitment to making sure people's pain served their own ending, rather than someone else's feast. The law was written, not to end war, only to change the shape of hell. And in the cold mathematics of cosmic balance, that might be enough. The galaxy did not heal. It never would. But it changed. Chaos still festered in the warp's depths, but hunger replaced dominance. Demons manifested with diminished frequency, their fuel supply cut at the source. The great game continued, yet played with smaller stakes, fewer pieces. The Imperium fragmented into regional powers, adapting doctrine to unstable warp currents or collapsing under self-inflicted purges. Some sectors canonized Madoka as unsanctioned saint, others branded her arch-heretic. Both were correct. Both were futile. Orcs surged across territories once demon-contested, filling vacuum with gleeful violence. Tyranids accelerated their consumption, unopposed by entities that no longer manifested reliably. Necrons woke in greater numbers, sensing destabilized balance ripe for ancient ambitions. And in every corner of this darker galaxy, when mortals reached despair's final threshold, someone arrived. White dress, infinite sorrow, carrying them away before hell could feast. The law persisted. Automatic, irrevocable, war raged on. But suffering no longer served its old masters. That was the only mercy the universe would ever grant. And that is also the end of this wide story. Madoka literally went into the scariest place in the galaxy and changed the rules of life and death. She starved the evil gods by making sure they can't eat human sadness anymore, which sounds like a win. But honestly, it kind of broke the galaxy too. Travel is now a mess, and other monsters like the orcs are having a field day because the demons are now gone. It is a classic 40k ending, where solving one problem just creates 3 new ones. She is carrying billions of souls now, which sounds like the heaviest job in this fucking existence. Personally, I think her choice was worth the chaos it caused for everyone else. But I wonder if she was a hero, or did she just break a world that was already falling apart?
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching and we will see you next time.